Good morning. I'm pleased to welcome you to Constitution and Citizenship Day on behalf of the Department of Political Science, and I'm joined by members of the Office of the Provost, the Dean of the Communications, and by our special speakers whom the Dean will introduce. Constitution and Citizenship Day is celebrated each year during the month of September, Constitution Week, in deference to the framers of the U.S. Constitution and the values that they hope to build into the Constitution. This is, of course, a landmark document that continues to guide our nation. Howard University, along with universities around the country, celebrates this event every year since 2005, when it was introduced. We pay special attention at Howard to the Constitution as a living document that is continuously interpreted and reinterpreted to adapt to our evolving society. While we adhere to its core values, we are also concerned with its historical limitations. In particular, those that limit or extend the fullest access to citizenship and citizenship rights which many of our ancestors never got to enjoy. This day is inspired in part by Congress's conclusion in 2005 that our national security included the affirmation of our national values. This year, the topic is the choice, the Constitution, and your vote, and the Supreme Court. This discussion will be led by our panelist, a prominent journalist and law professor, as well as our Dean of Communications. And I think we are here today to explore public awareness of the complexities of the Constitution and the Supreme Court selection process and its interpretation with this special panel. We are grateful to the Office of the Provost, to the Dean, to the of Communications, to Howard University Student Association in particular, and to the Law School Dean as well as to the Howard University Library for promoting Constitution and Citizenship Day. Thank you for coming.
Good morning. My name is Johnette Dates, and I'm Dean in the John H. Johnson School of Communications. Welcome to this year's session on Constitution Day. The choice, your vote, and the Supreme Court. What we're going to do is have a conversation with people who are knowledgeable about some issues that relate to this topic. I'm going to introduce the panelists by starting with Jack White. Jack White actually was not born on Howard's campus, but he spent a lot of times on this campus, a lot of years as he was growing up. His dad had an office in what was then Freedman's Hospital, which is where the John H. Johnson School of Communications is currently housed. And he used to run up and down the halls, he told me, with a cap pistol terrifying the patients. His brother and sisters were actually born in the C.B. Powell building, which was then Freedman's Hospital. So his ties to Howard are deep and abiding, as he shared with me. But to get to his background, he is now an independent journalist based in Richmond, Virginia. But he's a former columnist for Time magazine and a frequent contributor to TheRoot.com. He writes about politics, race, and social issues. He's won many journalism awards, including the Before Columbus Foundation's American Book Award, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the New York Association of Black Journalists, and the Unity Award from Lincoln University. He was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, and in 1995, Time Incorporated, the in-house newsletter, named him the best writer at any of the company's magazines, which included at the time Time, Fortune, Sports Illustrated, and People. In 1999, the National Association of Black Journalists selected him as one of the 100 most influential black journalists of the 20th century. In a 29-year career with Time magazine, from which he retired in 2001, Mr. White served as a correspondent in Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, New York, Nairobi, and Washington, D.C., and as editor of the Nation section, which covers national affairs. In 1995, he became the first black journalist to be a columnist for a national news weekly. He served as a writer-in-residence at Howard University in the John H. Johnson School of Communications, as a visiting professor at the Scripps Howard Endowed Professor at Hampton University, and as an adjunct professor of journalism at Virginia Commonwealth University. There is much more that I could say about Jack White, but I will stop there, and I will now introduce our second panelist, Professor Lisa A. Crooms. Professor Crooms teaches constitutional law, gender, and the law, international human rights law, and Supreme Court jurisprudence. She teaches in the Howard University Law School. Professor Crooms received her BA in economics from Howard University and her JD from the University of Michigan. A human rights activist since 1984, Professor Crooms has worked with the Washington Office on Africa and the American Committee on Africa, and she is currently a board member for the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, the U.S. Human Rights Network, and the Women's Institute for Leadership Development for Human Rights. She's also a coordinator of the U.S. Coordinated Non-Government Organization, and she has numerous other things that I could say about her background. But what I want to do now is to move to ask Mrs. Crooms and Mr. White to begin our conversation on this 2008 Constitution Day celebration at Howard University by focusing on the significance of presidential choices. Because as we all know, the President of the United States chooses the justices for the Supreme Court during the time when there is a vacancy and they are in office. And the choices that we as citizens makes a difference, therefore, in how the Supreme Court will be staffed by justices. And that affects our society for many, many years to come, because the justices in the U.S. Supreme Court have lifelong appointments. So it is very important for us to understand the significance of who we choose to be the President of the United States. Having said that, I will ask our panelists to take a few minutes, each one of them take maybe 10 minutes or so, as long as you want, to talk a bit about the significance of the presidential election and this whole issue of the Supreme Court. Who wants to start?
Okay. Thank you. As Dean Date said, it's always a pleasure for me to come back to the Howard University campus, because I did literally used to play right out there on that quad when I was a kid, and it wasn't just patients in the hospital that I used to chase after. It was beautiful young undergraduate students such as those I see in the audience. It's also appropriate to be here because Howard University is at the law school at Howard University is where the strategy was hatched that led to the Brown versus Board decision in 1954 that struck down school segregation and ultimately led to the candidacy this year of Barack Obama as Democratic nominee. It's unthinkable that a black man could be nominated as the presidential candidate of either of the major parties without going back to the whole history of the civil rights movement in this country. The Brown decision in '54 led a few years later to, and I'm not being inclusive here, totally inclusive here, I just want to hit some highlights, to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allowed black people who had been disenfranchised to become participants in the political process as voters. Subsequently, this led to an enormous surge in blacks running for office around the country, culminating in 1984 in Reverend Jackson's first run for the presidency. Without which it's inconceivable that Obama would have been able to run for president this year. So we've had a process that you might almost think of as being like a birth. The conception being the 1954 decision, the quickening being the passage of Voting Rights Act, and the stirring of the baby of kicking around before birth being Jackson's candidacy. And this year, particularly if Obama succeeds in being elected, this will be the birth. It's been a long process, but it's been a steady process, and it's only because of the the focus, the keeping their eye on the ball of black activists dating back to long before our births, that this progress has been possible. This year, this presidential campaign, though, is especially an important one. This is a big election. They tend to have elections, can be classified as ones in which the issues that are being confronted are relatively minor, and those which are potentially epoch-making, epoch-changing. And the ground is changing under our feet right now. It's not simply that for the first time that a black candidate might be elected, or if the Republicans prevail, that a woman might be elected vice president. It's also that some of the fault lines, the generational fault lines, and some of the issues fault lines that have been building up, just as like in an earthquake, tectonic plates come together and eventually one of them snaps and you have an earthquake. Something similar to that is happening in political terms this year, and it's happening in issues across the board. Particularly happening, though, with respect to our topic today, the Constitution. You could not find a starker contrast in approach to who should staff the Supreme Court and the sort of rulings that might come about as a result of those staffing than you'll find between John McCain and Barack Obama. Some of you may have seen the joint meeting they had with the clergyman Rick Warren, the evangelical leader, a few weeks ago, and he asked the two of them, which current members of the Supreme Court would you not have appointed? John McCain, the Republican, said that he would not have appointed Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the other more liberal members of the four-member more liberal bloc on the court. It so happens, by the way, just as an aside, that those are the four members who helped support the most important piece of legislation that John McCain has ever produced during his long Senate career, which was about campaign finance reform. On the other hand, when Barack Obama was asked this question, he said that the person he would not have appointed was Clarence Thomas. The opposite side. So you get a sense from their answers to those questions that these two men have enormously different approaches to the kinds of people that they would put on the court. Now, it most clearly shows up, and the issue that's on most people's minds now is what's going to happen to Roe versus Wade, which was the Supreme Court decision which legalized abortion in this country. It's long been a goal of the Republican right wing to reverse Roe versus Wade and to send whether or not abortion should be legal, send that issue back to the states in the hopes that abortion would be made illegal all around the country. You see this in John McCain's selection of Sarah Palin, the governor of Alaska, who is a staunch anti-abortionist who does not even believe in abortion in cases of rape and incest. That these people are committed to reversing that decision, which many women regard as being an important affirmation of their rights to control their own bodies. Obama, on the other hand, although he has said that he would like to reduce the number of abortions, has been a supporter of Roe v. Wade and of the right to abortion. So just on this issue alone, you see this stark contrast, and it goes across the board. That's only the most visible one. And but I can assure you that the stark differences of that sort also apply to voting rights, to the question of affirmative action, all sorts of things that have special impact for African Americans in particular. Now, beyond that level, there are a number of other legal issues that are going to arise in the campaign that are not directly impacted by the Supreme Court, but are affected by it in an indirect way. Ward Connolly, who some of you may have heard of, who is the person who has been running around the country sponsoring state initiatives to outlaw affirmative action at the state level, is up to it again. He's already been